Wilson Center. This is, I think, as you all know, a place where public policy and research meet. They bring together the world of ideas with the world of policy action. Very happy that Cindy Aronson, the director of our Latin American program, is here this morning. Also want to acknowledge Miguel Salazar, who had a lot to do with the planning of this event on our end. And of course, very pleased that this is an event we're co-sponsoring with Immigration Works, which really did most of the organization of this. Tamar Jacoby, you'll hear from in a minute. The president of Immigration Works really put this panel together, as well as very proud to co-sponsor with Arizona State University. We have a very long relationship with Arizona State University, working on a number of issues, as does Immigration Works. I want to acknowledge Lázaro Cárdenas, who I see in the audience here, is a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a former governor of Michoacan and distinguished Mexican colleague, and many other good friends here. Good to see Dan and Roberto and many others back at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Some in you guys' even, like Dan, who is now out of government and into his civilian life. There's no doubt that the Latino vote was important in this past election. When we started to put this together, we didn't know how important it would be. This was actually an event that was planned ahead of the elections themselves, and we started it with a question mark. We decided to keep the question mark on there, only because there are, of course, many people that will claim that election outcomes were the result of different factors. But I don't think there's any doubt in it. For anyone who watched endless hours of talk TV and talk radio the days after the elections, like me, knows that there was probably no theme that came up more often than the importance of the Latino vote. And for many of us that have followed these issues, some like Roberto with great expertise, others like me with much more generality, for the past couple decades. We've been saying for a long time the Latino vote is really going to matter in national elections. It's really going to matter. This is going to be the year the Latino vote really comes home. I think after a while we stopped believing it for the most part. We kind of figured someday it will really be a decisive factor. I think you can make a plausible argument, and I suspect some of our panelists will today, that in this election it really was a decisive factor. It may not have been the only one, but it certainly was one of the decisive factors. And there's a number of things we could ask here. First of all, how much of a decisive factor was it compared to other things? Clearly, it's one of them, but how much did it matter in the outcome? Not just in the presidential race, but obviously in congressional races and in many of the state races as well. Why was it such a decisive factor? Why now and not other times that many of us have predicted it? How much was immigration policy a factor in this? I mean, there's a tendency to conflate the Latino vote with immigration policy. I think you'll hear from the panelists that is a grave error. That these are actually different things. Immigration policy has a different set of constituencies far beyond Latino voters, and Latino voters care about a lot of things beyond immigration policy. But clearly there is some sort of relationship there. So to what extent did immigration policy play into this, and are there effects on immigration policy going forward? But are also there ways that candidates approach issues that may affect the way different groups vote for them? And I think that's a key question. Beyond specific policy, the assumption is that immigration policy drove the Latino vote in a lot of the general media. There may be much more indirect correlations there, which is how candidates and how parties talk about immigrants overall. And Latinos, for the most part, at this point, have closer ties to an immigrant past or an immigrant present within families than other groups in U.S. society. And so how candidates approach immigrants rather than immigration policy may be decisive. And let me throw out one more thing, which is, there was a great commentary, and I wish I could remember who the author was, the day after the election, a Republican analyst who said, the Republican Party did really well on Latino leaders, but not on Latino followers. And if you look at it, in fact, the two governors who are Latino in this country are both Republicans. Two of the three senators who are Latino are Republicans. Republicans have not done so badly on recruiting actually Latino politicians, something we could not have said 10 years ago. Democrats were way on their way. Republicans have actually caught up on this, or at least are catching up, and certainly catching up relative to the support that they have gotten from the Latino electorate. So is there a difference between Latino leaders and Latino supporters? Does this look forward to the fact that the Republican Party is maybe getting ahead of the game and will do better in the future? Or are we looking at the fact where Republicans have made those inroads and still are unable to attract the Latino vote? And the converse for Democrats. Are Democrats in a position to feel comfortable that what they have done is secure a strong base of support among Latino voters and they can count on it? Or should Democrats be worried that in the long term Republicans may eat their lunch? with some of these voters who are currently supporting them. And I think these are things you'll hear different perspectives from the group. Now that I've made a little bit of time for some of you to arrive, let me turn it over to the real host here. And before I do that, let me acknowledge those of you that came in, actually. Good to see all of you. Tamar is being mic'd up. And Tamar Jacoby, President of Immigration Works.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you for being on time. I'm Tamar Jacoby. I'm president of Immigration Works USA. We're a national federation of employers, mostly small business owners, working for better immigration law. We're kind of the advocacy side of this trio, but we're not wearing our advocacy hat today. I'm very pleased to be co-sponsoring the event with the Woodrow Wilson Center and Arizona State University. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Cynthia Arnson, director of the Latin American program here at Woodrow Wilson. Our allies at ASU who are not here. We're very grateful to General Counsel Jose Cardenas and Vice President Jim O'Brien, who made this happen on the ASU end, and very grateful to my team, who did a terrific job in putting it together. So I think Andrew framed the issue very nicely for us. We don't need too much more of that. You know, the frame that really says it all, in my view, is 71-27, 71% to 27%, the presidential vote margin. And it's not just an incredibly lopsided presidential vote margin, it's a presidential vote margin in the nation's fastest growing voting bloc. A voting bloc, by one estimate, likely to double in size over the next 20 years. You heard me right, double in size by 2030. So, you know, anybody who didn't realize, some Republicans out there, and I am a Republican, but anybody who didn't realize the Latino vote was important before November 6th, you know, probably knows by now. Although I think it's true, as Andrew said, many of us who knew it was going to be important didn't really know how important and how significant and how stunning, in effect, it would be. No matter what the numbers were, how it would make an impression on the public and the political class this time. Certainly when we planned this event, as Andrew said, we did not know. We had no idea how much attention the issue would get in the days after the election. And I think, you know, we thought that we would come on a kind of a blank slate, and we would talk a little bit about how many people voted where, and we would kind of say it's going to be important going forward. Obviously, our job's a little harder now because you've all read those stories. But in a way, that gives us room, and our panelists room, to dig a little deeper, to look into the future, to think about significance, and to talk about some choices that lie ahead that we might not have done if the issue hadn't gotten so much attention in the last couple of weeks. So the morning is divided into two sessions. The first is a conversation about Arizona, narrowly focused on Arizona. What exactly happened in Arizona? And that needs a little bit of a kind of an explanation or a disclaimer. Arizona was a little bit of an anomaly this time. Latinos made up 18% of the people who voted in Arizona, so one of the states with the biggest Latino vote, but Obama didn't carry the state. In fact, Romney won big. The Latino Democratic Senate candidate, Richard Carmona, didn't win. And Sheriff Joe Arpaio, scourge of immigrants, legal and illegal, did win re-election comfortably. So not exactly what you would expect, big Latino vote, but it didn't translate into results. Still, we think that there's a lot that's interesting to be said about Arizona, and I won't steal the fire of the people who are going to say it. We're looking at it in particular because of the ASU connection, but there's a lot to learn. It's a very interesting microcosm. So the first panel is about Arizona with that kind of, just to be aware of that disclaimer. We're certainly not saying Arizona is typical. The second session will zoom out, pull back from Arizona, and look at the big picture, the scope and significance of the Latino vote nationally. And I'll say more about that when the time comes. But for now, I just think I want to thank you all for being here, and let's get going. I'm going to hand the stage over to Stephen Dinan, who's the politics editor of the Washington Times, who's going to conduct a conversation about Arizona with Rodolfo Espino, who's an associate professor in the School of Politics at ASU. So thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Rudy. Take it away.
So, Professor Spino, good to have you here. I am Stephen Dinan. I'm politics editor at the Washington Times. I agree with what Tamar just said. Actually, I think you can learn a lot about the national stage from immigration conversations and the Latino voter in particular from what went on in Arizona. In particular, the counterfactual sort of explores the limits of, it tests the limits of what we can learn about Latino voters and their effect both on electoral politics and on policy. So I guess I'd like to start with just sort of a basic question. If somebody were to ask me what the white voter is, I would have no clue how to actually answer that question. So let's start with the very tough one, which is, what is the Latino voter, or what is a Latino voter? And in particular, what is the Latino voter in Arizona? Who is he or she? How much of the electorate, how much of the population, how the citizen rates? Who is that person?
Okay. Yeah. As many in the audience already know, the Latino population in the United States is very diverse, coming from various national origin backgrounds. Mexican-American primarily. Of course, there's the Cuban and Puerto Ricans. In Arizona, it's the Latino population there is like the Latino population in neighboring states, primarily of Mexican origin. But one thing that's unique about the Latino population in Arizona, a lot of them are recent arrivals, not necessarily foreign-born, but having migrated from, let's say, California, Texas, New Mexico, because of the draw of the job opportunities in Arizona over the last decade or so. But that's not unlike perhaps the white population too. It's very hard to find native Arizonans. So a lot of the people there are transplants from elsewhere. And I think that explains a lot as to why the Latino voters are still the sleeping giant in Arizona. We saw them surging in New Mexico, of course, and of course Colorado, Nevada. But in Arizona, they're still asleep, and some people ask why. And I think in part it's because they have not established the roots in the community like Latino populations have in, say, California or Texas.
Go into the numbers a little bit. What percentage of the population? We heard what percentage of the electorate they made up this time around. Give us some sense for the percentage of the population, what they, the growth rate, the expansion.
In Arizona, approximately 1/3 of the population are of Hispanic background. But when we take into consideration the qualifications to be able to vote, the voting age population, you only have 25% that are eligible to vote, well, in terms of being over 18. But of that population, 1/3 are disqualified from participating in elections because of their citizenship status. So that whittles the numbers down dramatically, and so you really only have about 15% of the electorate being, of the registered voters being Hispanic.
And what are the projections for say the next 2 decades or so? Will they become, will they double as the national voting bloc looks like? What are they going to do?
Demographic trends in Arizona suggest that Latino populations will, there'll be a much larger share of the electorate in elections to come. But one thing that's important to keep in mind in Arizona is not just what the Latino population is like and who they are, but who is the white population in Arizona. The white population in Arizona is a much older population than, let's say, white populations in other states. You have a lot of snowbirds, retirees coming there. So one thing you have to take into account about these demographic trends is the Latino population is very young, is aging. You have an older white population that's not replacing itself and is dying off. So that replacement of Latinos into the electorate will, I think, probably happen a lot faster in Arizona than we have seen in other states.
So let's get into a little bit about what the Latino voter in Arizona cares about. And I guess give me a sense for, as we heard from Andrew earlier, there's been this conflation of Latino voters and immigration. In particular, folks in my profession like to do this. And there's definitely a lot of nuance there that needs to be dealt with. What are the top issues that Arizona Latino voters tell pollsters they care about, and do we believe what they tell pollsters? I guess deal with both of those, because there's definitely some questions about polling overall, and in particular among various subgroups, Latino voters in particular.
Yeah, well, with respect to that latter question, I would refer any members in the audience that want to get some good insight into the mind of Latino voters. I refer them to latinodecisions.com that does frequent polling of Latino voters in key states, including Arizona. And so a lot of the numbers I refer to come from Latino Decisions. Now, with respect to the concerns of Latino voters. Latino voters are not unlike other voters in the country. Over the last couple of years, one of their most primary concerns has been the state of the economy. Of course, their position on how to fix the economy is different. You know, it falls along partisan lines. But closely related to that is immigration reform. And in Arizona, Latino voters show more concern over immigration reform, the passive of comprehensive immigration reform, than, say, Latinos in other states, in part because of what has been happening in Arizona. As many people know, Arizona is famous or infamous for the passage of SB 1070. And that has remained in the news. It was passed in the spring of 2010, but the drumbeat of SB 1070 remained in the news over the last couple of years, and of course was helped with the recent Supreme Court ruling, and of course Latino activists on the ground seeking to get Latino voters registered and turned out to vote, and they used the issue of SB 1070 as a talking point, a galvanizing lightning rod to get them registered and mobilized.
What do you? I think we were talking earlier about the comparisons of polling from a number of states. I think there was Latino Decisions polling. Looked at a number of states. Was it pre-election polling, just the night before the election, as I recall, was the polling. Looked at a number of states, and Arizona and North Carolina both were the ones that had that had that distinction, I guess, of immigration versus the economy and whatnot. Do you draw any significance from that versus the other states that they looked at?
Yeah, I mean, I think that presents an opportunity. You know, as Tamar had mentioned at the beginning, you know, there was a lot of expectations put on the Latino voters that, oh my goodness, you're going to get a Latino elected to the U.S. Senate from Arizona, and perhaps Arpaio will be gone now. That did not transpire. But you look at the concern that Latino voters in Arizona, and specifically they're split 50-50. 47%, approximately 48% are saying that the economy is important, 47% saying immigration reform is important. So that's at the forefront. And that is going to remain up there because the Latino activists that have been on the ground registering Latino voters are still going out there and using that as a talking point to get them out to the polls.
So I've sort of been dancing around this question. Let's get to it. Why did Arpaio win? What happened in Arizona this year? What was the difference between Arizona and other places where we believe that Latino voters and in particular issues that they promoted carried elections?
Yeah, when it comes down to it, why did Arpaio win? It was money. He raised approximately $8 million for his campaign for a county sheriff seat, right? It you know, blew all records out of the water.
Do we know what the previous record was?
Oh, maybe $2 million? I'm not sure, but it was hand over fist money that he used almost all of it for campaign ads. And Phoenix is not an expensive media market. His opponent, his Democratic opponent, Paul Panzone, had about $600,000 to $800,000 on hand. So it's just it was unfair, right? It's just an unfair playing field for the Democratic candidate. And another thing too that you have to, I think that signals that the Latino vote did make a difference was how Arpaio changed his campaign ads. In the past, he used to talk about how he was tough on the border, tough on immigration. His ads shifted tone. It's what political scientists might refer to as, rather than issue-oriented ads, they became warm, fuzzy, biographical ads, right? They featured him sitting with his wife, who we never seen before, really, talking about his 50 years in law enforcement, how he's a grandfather, cares about children. I mean, who doesn't care about children, right? And so he very much shifted the tone because I think the recall of Russell Pierce sent a signal to a lot of elected Republicans in Arizona that if you continue to march down that road of scapegoating Latino voters, they can turn out and vote you out of office, as we saw with Russell Pierce, who was the author of Arizona's SB 1070.
Do we know anything about Latino voters in that Arpaio race in particular?
I'm still waiting to get the precinct level data, but
Okay.
from what I'm hearing from a lot of people that were active in mobilizing Latino voters, they did break records in terms of getting more Latinos registered, of course. I think there was a 40% increase in the number of Latinos registered from 2008 to 2012. And of course, that results in more Latinos turning out to the poll. And one thing, too, that these activists did was educate Latino voters. Rather than just signing them up, educating them on how to vote, and specifically on how to vote in Arizona, because we have a mail-in ballot process. And we also have a voter ID law in place. So a lot of the organizations were educating Latino voters, look, it may be easier for you to sign up on the mail-in list, so that way you don't have to deal with identification and what have you if you don't have the proper ID and if you choose to vote in person. And I think that explains why there were so many mail-in ballots cast in the general election in 2012.
I want to actually get back to the Senate race in just a quick minute, but stick with the voter ID requirements and whatnot, and talk about the restrictions, what exactly the requirements are, and in particular, you know, there's been this question at the national level about Republicans, whether they're using voter ID requirements to tamp down on voter turnout from certain areas. What are the concerns? How's the Latino population, Latino voters in Arizona? How are they dealing with that? Are there problems we're hearing? Is there going to be a battle over trying to tighten those the voter ID requirements? Or is it a photo ID requirement in particular?
Yeah, really quickly, Arizona's voter ID law was voted on by the citizens of Arizona back in 2004 with Proposition 200. It was challenged in the federal court. And it was shot down at the district level, and it was going to be put on appeal, but the Marion County, Indiana case rendered that moot for the Supreme Court decision, in which Indiana has a tougher voter ID law than Arizona. So challenges to Arizona's voter ID law were dropped. The basic requirements are just that you have to have a picture ID, a state driver's license, for instance. And the important thing, though, is that your address that you're registered to vote at has to match the address on that identification. So this can hit populations that are more mobile than others, younger than others, and that's Latino voters.
Is there a sense that that this was targeted towards Latino vote, or is there a sense that it will be used to try and to tamp down on Latino vote in the future?
Well, the initial challenges, you had challenges being filed by the Navajo Nation because it also affected them. They actually settled out of the court with the state of Arizona, and there were exceptions given to them about Navajo Nation ID that that they could use to vote. But Latino voters, the lawsuit being filed was by MALDEF, and the evidence that they were bringing to bear was showing that there was a drop-off in Latino voter registration following the implementation of Prop 200. But as far as I see it, Prop 200, that voter ID law in Arizona is the law. It's not going to be challenged. It's going to pretty much stay in place.
So I said we would get back to the Senate race, and
Yeah.
let's do that. So you had Arpaio win, and you had a Latino candidate, Democratic candidate lose. What happened in the Senate race? You obviously had Jeff Flake, a longtime incumbent who has a track record, an interesting track record on the immigration issue.
Yeah.
Talk about the way Latinos voted in there and the way that immigration played in that race.
Yeah. Well, to answer your question, why did Flake win? Why did Carmona lose? It really boils down to name recognition. Flake, as you indicated, is a well-known name in Arizona politics, serving since over the last decade.
And
his family name. Yeah, and the family name goes way back. He's his heritage goes back to the early Mormon pioneers. And that's another factor to keep in mind, just the level of enthusiasm among Mormon voters for voting for Jeff Flake, but also you had Mitt Romney on the ballot, a Mormon candidate. So you had high levels of enthusiasm among the Mormon electorate to vote for those two candidates. And that was a significant hurdle for Carmona and Obama's campaign to overcome in Arizona.
So let's actually delve into that really briefly, because it seems like there's a potential path for victory for Republicans that doesn't necessarily involve Latino voters if they can find other ways to tap in and expand their basis, as you just said, such as the Mormon vote. I guess the question is, the Republican Party in Arizona, how do they go forward, and do they choose to move towards trying to find other bases of support? Do they choose to try and reach out to Latino voters? What's their strategy going forward, and how viable is that strategy? Is this a one-off with two Mormon candidates on the ballot, or is there a viable strategy for them to find voters elsewhere and ignore the Latino vote?
No, I don't think they can continue to ignore the Latino vote. And now that Jeff Flake is in office, it'd be interesting to watch his whether he comes back home to his original position, being an advocate for immigration reform. When he made the run for the U.S. Senate seat, given the politics of Arizona, he certainly shifted back and became a border hawk, much like we saw John McCain in 2008 build that dang fence first before we talk about immigration reform. But now that he's safely elected for the next 6 years, perhaps he might be one of the key Republicans that brings up and pushes for comprehensive immigration reform in the U.S. Senate. And one interesting survey note that came from the Latino Decisions poll on election eve was a question that asked Latino voters in Arizona about their willingness to vote for Republicans if they took a leadership role on comprehensive immigration reform. And 39% of Latino voters in Arizona said if the Republican Party took a leadership role and ensured the passage of comprehensive immigration reform, that would make them more likely to vote for the Republican Party. And I think that finding right there tells Republicans in Arizona that rather than pursuing the strategy that perhaps Arpaio and Russell Pierce chose to do in the past, they may want to be rethinking their strategy and looking at the demographic growth trends in Arizona.
Which leads us right into the issue of, and we've talked about this slightly, the South over the last several over the last generation has steadily moved from a Democratic, solid Democratic voting bloc to the Republican stronghold. We've seen somewhat of the emergence of something similar with Latino voters, or at least Latino-dominant state or heavy states in Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico. How does Arizona fit into that? Arizona is not yet there. Talk about why Arizona is not at the level of those, I would put Nevada and Colorado as swing states, and New Mexico might be more solidly Democratic at this point. Where is Arizona along that trajectory, and is it, will we eventually see the emergence of the solid Latino swing bloc? Will it be the solid Latino Democratic bloc, or will it remain I guess diverse options for, like I said, Arizona on one side and others on the other?
Yeah, I'm always hesitant to look into a crystal ball, making these predictions about politics, because there's so many what ifs, like assuming though that nothing changes in Arizona, Arizona will become a blue or a swing state, or perhaps a blue state like New Mexico. Colorado, Nevada are now swing states because of the Latino vote. The reason Arizona is not there yet is because the white vote there is much more conservative than the white vote in Nevada and Colorado. But again, that white vote is aging and dying off at a very, very quick rate and being replaced by a younger Latino vote.
So it's pure demographics. The demographics will make the Latino vote that much more important as we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. But as I mentioned before, that does not mean that Republicans don't stand a chance in Arizona. Latinos are willing to vote for Republicans, and they've indicated they're willing to do so if Republicans take up the cause of something that's near and dear to Latino voters right now, and that's immigration reform.
And so let's talk about this specifically. What are Latino voters looking for specifically on immigration reform in Arizona? Is pathway to citizenship, it's interesting, I went back and was looking over these numbers, and the words pathway to citizenship, if you were almost non-existent in my profession and in articles. People never talked about pathway to citizenship. It was always the difference between amnesty and enforcement back 10 years ago or so. Starting in, I actually have the numbers. It's shocking how little people actually did it. It's been a 6-fold increase in the use of the words pathway to citizenship essentially since 2004 through 2008. Is pathway to citizenship the be-all and end-all for those voters? Is there something less than that Latino voters in Arizona would settle for? Are they looking for a good faith effort? Are they looking for legal status? Would they accept legal status short of pathway to citizenship? What are they looking for?
Well, pathway to citizenship, or amnesty as we might have called it back in 1986 with IRCA and Ronald Reagan, is one of the key things that Latinos are looking for with comprehensive immigration reform. And one of the reasons why, you might ask, well, Latino voters, they're U.S. citizens, so why should they care about pathway to citizenship? They're already citizens. Latino voters are very connected to individuals who do not have that citizenship status, whether they're here legally or illegally. The survey data compiled by Latino Decisions found that of Latino voters, approximately 2/3 indicated that they know someone that is here with an undocumented status. And furthermore, there's classifications of that undocumented status, and one that we hear a lot about is the so-called DREAM Act students. Those individuals that came here at a very young age, We know that Obama issued an order to change the DHS's deportation policy, which really made Latino voters more enthusiastic toward the Democratic ticket. But 2/3 of Latino voters know someone here that is here illegally. But more than half know someone that meets that DREAM Act qualification. And this is why Latino voters are very concerned about immigration reform, and specifically that pathway to citizenship. It's not because it affects them directly, it's because it may affect them indirectly via a friend or a family member.
I think we're still going to questions from the audience, correct? Yeah, so we'll do that in just a minute. I wanted to get to one other sort of very important question here, which is the Republican trap, the primary versus general election trap that Republicans seem to experience. What is the situation with that in Arizona? You mentioned the conservative, the conservative white population there. Go into what the Republicans face if they're trying to run in a primary versus a general election there. Do they have to toe a harder line on immigration, and do they have to toe a harder line on Latino voters overall?
Yeah. One thing that is, I get a lot of questions from people outside of Arizona. Oftentimes it involves this first question, which, what is wrong with Arizona? And specifically with Arizona politics. And one thing I always have to tell individuals is we have a unique election system, specifically with clean elections. You can get matching dollar per dollar contributions from the state of Arizona should you be going up against a well-financed candidate, whether it be in the primary or general election. And this has dramatically shifted the type of Republicans that are now being elected to the Arizona state legislature. Now with clean elections, rather than having to appeal to certain bases, say the Chamber of Commerce in Arizona, what I call the country club Republicans, you just go to the state of Arizona and be an ideologue, and you get matching dollar per dollar. And so your moderate, let's say business-oriented Republicans have been pushed out over the last 10, 15 years because of those clean election candidates that come with a specific issue or ideology or agenda. And that explains a lot, like the rise of Russell Pierce, but you also know about Russell Pierce's recall, and that happened at the primary level in the primary election because of grassroots activists, particularly Latino activists, in Russell Pierce's backyard, and the recruitment by those Latino activists of a more moderate Republican in Jerry Lewis to knock off Russell Pierce. And it also, that it was an interesting race because it also shows about the divide within the Mormon community. Russell Pierce, a Mormon. Jerry Lewis, a Mormon. But a Mormon who was adopting what, in Salt Lake City has a much moderate position on immigration than does, say, Russell Pierce. The Mormon Church was instrumental in passing what was called the Utah Compact, basically a decree by the Mormon Church and the, certain organizations in Utah saying we are going to treat all individuals with dignity and respect and not demonize them, essentially. And that influence has been coming down to Arizona, specifically to within the Mormon community, because the Mormon Church is very concerned about its outreach to Latino voters. One of the biggest growth groups for the Mormon Church are Latinos. And so when you have individuals like Russell Pierce, I'm a representative of the Mormon Church, doing what he's done, Mormon missionaries find the doors being slammed in their faces. So I think that's something that going forward, that the role of the Mormon Church in Arizona in pushing for their Republican elected officials to moderate their position is something that I expect we might see happening more and more.
I guess let's see, do we have microphones? Then I guess if there are questions for a professor, we'll go to the audience. Excellent. I actually do have a couple more than that I'd love to get to. That's great. One of these, there's been, and this gets into the national discussion as well, but the big debate among Republicans right now is, are Latino voters a conservative powerhouse waiting to be tapped if Republicans can get past the immigration issue? Or if you look at beyond the demographic numbers, in terms of just like socioeconomic characteristics, single-parent households, use of welfare programs, low income tax burden, they look a lot like Democratic voters. What is the situation in Arizona? Are those voters waiting to become, are they conservative voters waiting to be tapped by Republicans, or are they Democratic voters, or are they true swing voters?
At the moment, they are hardcore Democratic voters. But their position, their loyalty to the Democratic Party is not rock hard. And we saw this in 2010. Following, the long drawn-out process to pass health care reform, the congressional calendar got compressed. Democrats in Congress and the White House said, what are we going to take up in the remaining 6 months we have? Comprehensive immigration reform or climate legislation? Democrats in Congress and the White House chose the path of climate change legislation, passing the Cap and Trade Act to deal with global warming, instead of pursuing comprehensive immigration reform. This upset Latino voters across the country, but especially in Arizona. And Latino voters across the country, but in Arizona, chose to stay home. It's not that they didn't go vote for the Republican Party, because the Republican Party at that time wasn't doing any outreach, but they did not see their loyalty to the Democratic Party. We did not see it that strong in 2010 because of failure for Democrats to even signal that they viewed immigration reform as something important.
And talk real briefly about the actual leadership organizations within Arizona. Who is going after these voters? Who's recruiting them? And are they? What's the relationship between them? Are they leading Latino voters? Are the Latino voters pulling the organizations along? How is that working?
Yeah, I think there's been a change in the organizations and partly their organizational structure, but also their strategy in going out to Latino communities and getting Latinos registered to vote and mobilized. I would think that maybe about 8 years ago, I would describe it as a lot of activists from the 1960s, a lot of people with the long hair and the bandanas and marching their civil rights songs, and it just didn't work, right? A lot of Latino voters just did not connect to that message. And what you have now are Latino organizations. One of the biggest ones in Arizona lately has been a group called Promise Arizona, led by Petra Falcon, and their message is, they're not hearkening back to the 1960s. They're talking about 2012 and what Latino voters need now, and that's immigration reform. And not only that, but it's not organizations like Promise Arizona, but you have a lot of the DREAM Act individuals that are not allowed to vote in elections. They're going out and registering Latino voters. And I have former students that are impacted by this, and what they say to me is that while they cannot vote, they're making sure that they're getting people there that they know that can vote for them. And that's dramatic change from what we saw in 2008 and 2004.
Actually going ahead and doing pairing, saying, look, you go vote because I can't vote you individually, a pairing vote. It's a very interesting situation. I see we've gotten the stop sign, so that will be all for it. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
So now we are going to, as I say, zoom out and look at the big national picture. And we're going to do this, as you can tell, kind of Charlie Rose style. And the high concept is not all that high, but the high concept is that we're going to hear this story from three distinctly different points of view. We have, let's see, we do have in the order I can announce them. We have a Republican very personally involved in the campaign, a Democrat very personally involved in the campaign, and a nonpartisan analyst who's been looking at this subject for many years. And they're going to look at two really big questions, or all the questions they're going to look at fall into two buckets. One is what actually happened this fall, what happened on Election Day, what happened in the run-up to election, who voted where. We're going to try to get you some detail on that, sort of dig a little deeper under the myth of, the giant that, or not the myth, but the big national story of the giant that determined the election. And number two, they're going to look from their different points of view at the future. Because the future really is kind of the game here. There is no doubt that we're at the very beginning stages of a sea change that's going to transform American politics. And just to unpack that a little bit, let me go a little deeper into that number I threw out earlier, a vote that is going to double in size over the next 20 years. So that's a Pew number, the Pew Research Center, and if you want to look up the paper, it was issued on November 14th. And of course, there's a number of different assumptions that go into a projection like that, some variables. So number one, the authors assumed that this year's success, this flexing of muscle and sense of power, is going to encourage more Latinos to register and vote. Because although the vote was important this time, Latino registration and voting rates are still very, very low, way beneath non-Hispanic, white, and African-American voters. And I'm sure someone on the panel will tell us a little more about that. So one of the assumptions was that this year's success will encourage more political activity, civic activity. Paper also assumes that Congress will eventually create a path to citizenship for the millions of unauthorized immigrants already in the country. And the third assumption was that, that the 5 million Latinos living in the U.S. who are already eligible to become citizens but haven't done it yet, who have green card holders who could become citizens but haven't naturalized, that they will. But all of those three assumptions together made up only a small piece of this doubling. Because the real motor of the doubling, the real driver of change, is age, or actually, more accurately, youth. And to understand this, you have to think about two numbers. This year, 12.5 million Latinos voted, 12.5. The other number, there are 18 million Latinos in America who are under 18 years old. 12.5, 18. And 93% of them are US-born citizens. All they have to do is grow up. Like nothing has to happen. Congress doesn't have to do anything. All they have to do, and I guarantee you they will, is grow up. So welcome to the future, a vote that is likely to double by 2030. And that opens a whole box, I won't say Pandora's box because it's a good box, treasure chest of interesting questions for this panel. How are Latinos going to use their newfound power, their newfound and growing power? What obviously is Latino vote going to mean for both parties? Very fraught question. What are Latino voters in the future going to look like? Because after all, the generation you're seeing now is really a transitional generation, right? These are immigrants and the children of immigrants. They're on their way to becoming Americans. In a generation, Latino vote's going to look, may look different. They still may remember what happened now, and we'll talk about that, but they will look different. And even bigger question, and I'm taxing the crystal ball powers of my panel, but what is the Latino vote going to mean for the issues that are at the center of American politics? Could that change? Will that change? So there are a lot of really interesting questions, and we are going to do some future gazing here, but want to dig into what we know and what we can say about those big questions. So I'm going to introduce the panelists as I ask them their first question, rather than just boring recitation of your brilliant qualifications. So Dan, let's start with you.
All right.
And the question is, what did you do, so to speak, on your autumn vacation? You obviously come out of a lot of big jobs in the Obama administration, but you were most recently one of President Obama's principal surrogates in Spanish language media. What did the election look like from your point of view? What can you tell us about it that we didn't read in the newspaper? From your personal experience, tell us what happened.
I think the way to understand kind of my role as a surrogate this year is in juxtaposition to 4 years ago. I basically played the same role in 08 and in 12 in terms of outreach to Spanish language media on behalf of the president, or then candidate. And the fascinating thing for me as I emerged from government and went out back into campaign land was the proliferation of Spanish language media outlets. In 2008, Spanish language media essentially meant national Spanish language media, which was two, Univision and Telemundo, a little bit of CNN Español, and local media in South Florida. And that's pretty much the sum total of the outlets that I hit over and over and over and over again 4 years ago. This time, I ended up doing media in, again, the National, Univision, Telemundo. Now there's Mundo Fox. CNN Español has a bigger footprint domestically than it had 4 years ago. And in 10 states. I did radio in Iowa and Ohio, in North Carolina and Virginia, obviously in Florida, but in Nevada and Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona. And it's that deepening and that proliferation of Spanish language media outlets that I think tells you a lot about, that we can go into later, about the proliferation of the Latino vote. Obviously this is a segment of the Latino vote, the Spanish dominant portion of it, but an interesting subset of the vote. So that I think that kind of that difference between 08 and 12, it also gets into some of the structural differences of the Obama campaign, Obama for America in 08 versus 12 that we can get into later.
Well, talk a little more about that. So you've talked about how it's changing the media, and we have what Rudy told us about Arizona, about changing the organization style. So how's it changing the substance of how Democrats, is that changed? Is the way Democrats are talking to Latinos, has that even changed in 4 years?
Absolutely. I think a couple of things happened. We started much earlier this time. I think for all those, a word of hope for Republicans, not something I often do. Let's remember back to the spring of 2008. There was a candidate in that election who had a Latino problem that Latinos weren't going to vote for. Right. Quite famously said by a pretty well-recognized expert on the Latino vote. And that candidate was Barack Obama. He had gotten a later start engaging with the Latino electorate than his primary rival, then Senator Clinton. This time, and it was true, we started later in 08 for a variety of reasons than had the Clinton campaign. This time you had a Latino vote director in Chicago in a year out. Wow. You had many more people in Chicago dedicated to targeting Latino voters, finding them and communicating with them in that whole spectrum of ways you've heard about the Obama campaign, communicating with folks with new technologies. You also had a lot of segmentation. One of the reasons that I was able to do interviews in all the places that I talked about, I happen to speak a very neutral Spanish. You can't really place my Spanish geographically for kind of quirky set of reasons. And that allowed OFA to use me in a multitude of places. There's one place, for example, though, to highlight the segmentation, where I did one interview all fall, which was Orlando, which has a large Spanish language media, but it's a Puerto Rican electorate. And you don't need somebody with my skill set or even my neutral Spanish speaking to Puerto Ricans. You need fellow Puerto Ricans speaking to Puerto Ricans. And that's also true in other parts of the country. There was a much more deliberate effort this time to ensure in ads and in media outreach and just people-to-people outreach that you were speaking to and through folks from the same subgroup.
And different issues as well, this last one? I mean, is immigration coming to
interesting.
In a different
the
way?
Issues this time, at least in my experience, and you saw this borne out a little bit in the national exit polls, the issues that Latinos cared about this time were very much the issues, the mainstream, if you will, the national issues. The economy was 60%, healthcare overperformed in terms of an issue that Latinos cared about more in the national exit polls than did the rest of the electorate. The budget deficit, and then foreign policy. So the four top issues were the same in a slightly different order than they were for the rest of the electorate. The budget deficit and healthcare were in opposite places for the rest of the electorate. This time it was a little more those domestic issues, those domestic-driven issues than 4 years ago. In my experience, again, part of that is where the media was focused and the nature of the Spanish-speaking community in South Florida that's particularly foreign policy driven. This time, even that community wasn't. And to the extent I was talking about foreign policy, I was talking about Benghazi rather than Cuba.
I want to move to Alfonso, but just last question. But you didn't use the word immigration. Immigration was not in that format?
It came up a little. It came up a little bit. It came up a little bit. And it came up in the following way. People wanted to know that the president cared about the issue. They wanted to understand why it hadn't been achieved in his first term. It served almost in these interviews the same function that I view it serving generally, which is that of a threshold issue. And by that I mean if you're okay on immigration, they'll listen to the rest of it. If you're not okay on immigration, they're not going to listen to the rest of it, which I think is part of, I don't think it's fully the problem Republicans have right now with Latinos, but it's part of. So it served a little bit, in these kind of this anecdotal evidence derived from interviews, that it was an issue, but it was almost a, you're okay on this issue, let's talk about the rest of it.
Fascinating. Great. Okay, Alfonso, same question to you. What did you do on your autumn vacation? Now, I know that you organized an independent expenditure Spanish language TV ad campaign in Nevada. So explain to us what that means. How does that work? What were the ads like? What did the election look like from your point of view? And if you will, in your first intervention, stick to your personal experience, and then we'll broaden it out.
Right. Well, the great thing about doing an independent expenditure is that it's independent. You don't coordinate with the Republican Party or with a Romney campaign. So I'm not here to defend, thankfully, the Romney campaign. But we realized that we needed to do something different, that the Latino vote was going to be decisive. And with the limited funding that we had, we said, let's go to a state where we can make a difference, a state that is manageable, and show that that yes, indeed, we recognize that the economy is the #1 issue in unemployment, but that we can't just talk about it through ads. We have to actually go to the community and go one vote, go after every single voter. Something that I think the Obama campaign did very well. And that's what we did in Nevada, again, with very limited funding. So there was a very organized grassroots effort. Because we knew we had limited funding, we couldn't engage absolutely every single Latino voter. In Nevada, the Latino vote went from 15% to 18% dramatically. And so we worked with evangelical churches, recognizing that that's a sector of the Latino electorate where conservatives are very strong. So we did community meetings, town halls. We had town halls of over 200 people. Imagine, conservatives doing a town hall with over 200 people. Nobody read about this or heard about this because it wasn't happening. It was just happening in Nevada. We ran ads. The issue said was we believe that with Latinos we needed a combined message. We couldn't win just by talking about unemployment and the economy. Again, talking about unemployment and the economy in a grassroots way, in a populist way, making the argument why the policies of the president are not good for the Latino community or for Latino businesses. But then we understood that immigration was a very important issue, and somehow we needed to neutralize it. So we talked about Obama's failed promise on immigration. He promised immigration, he didn't deliver when he had a Democratic House and Senate. And we also brought up another issue, which was deportations, which wasn't talked at all in the campaign, where the president was attacking Mitt Romney for saying that the Arizona law was a model for the nation, when he didn't exactly say that. But regardless, the Romney campaign didn't explain the position, the governor's position very well. But attacking Arizona, during his first term, the president has implemented an enforcement policy that is much more punitive than the Arizona law, deporting more people than any other president in history. The majority of them, people without criminal records. So we ran ads in Spanish language about this. And we also topped it off talking about social issues. Basically, the president's position on life, on marriage, saying the president is too radical for Latinos. Understanding there's a big chunk of the Latino electorate that is very socially conservative and will vote exclusively for those issues. And then finally, we had a very strong get out the vote effort, persuasive calls. So it was a very an overall effort. Just to conclude, the only state where Romney did better than McCain this time around was Nevada,
okay,
by about 4 points. That's nothing, right? But is it coincidence? Perhaps. But I think it shows that if you invest in an effort, and you have a broad message, a populist message, you can win. At the end, obviously, we were outspent. Governor Romney had made very unfortunate statements during the campaign about immigration. He was handicapped from the beginning. I'd say he was mortally wounded from the beginning. However, I would disagree with Dan in the sense that immigration was key.
But that's what's so interesting, right? The asymmetry here is fascinating. For Democrats, they don't have to talk about it because it's a threshold issue and they've passed that threshold. For Republicans, we're not over the threshold, and so we do have to talk about it all the time. I mean, that's a fascinating asymmetry. But what about, let me press you a little bit on these social issues. I mean, the polling is very mixed on that. I've been saying for years, you know, it's the great Reagan line about Latinos or Republicans, they just don't know it. But on the social issues, the polling is starting to come up kind of mixed.
Well, the thing is that, first of all, we understood as we went in, and this is a very important point, Latinos are not a monolithic community. This whole Latino vote phenomenon is an American phenomenon. When you come here, you're from Cuba, you're from Nicaragua, you're from Guatemala, you're from Mexico, you're not Latino. You come here and all of a sudden you're Latino. What does that mean? We are seeing an incredible change in the Latino community. The Latino community of 30 years ago is very different from the Latino community today. I think about 40% of Latinos today are foreign born, generally. The rest, many, perhaps most, are the children of immigrants. So with the electorate, we're seeing that. I mean, we still have multi-generational Latinos from the Southwest, Puerto Ricans in New York and Chicago who are very liberal, but we're starting to see the rise of foreign-born Latinos and their children who tend to be more conservative. I mean, just look at the Pew numbers. On abortion, still the majority believe that abortion should be legal compared to about 40% of the rest of the population. Marriage, that is shifting. It has certainly shifted in the past 5 years, but there's still a good chunk of that electorate that is very conservative when it comes to marriage. The question is with social issues is not, are you going to scare voters away? We believe that those who vote exclusively for those issues are going to vote, are the mostly religious people who are going to vote for the candidate who has the traditional positions. Nobody's not going to go against a candidate because of their position on life and marriage within the Latino community.
Right, but it's scary to me because it is a place where we're not looking, again, we're not looking to the future. I mean, as a Republican, we're counting on the older ones and not looking to how the vote's going to change.
But you will be surprised with the children of foreign-born Latinos. They're still much more conservative than the rest of the population.
Okay, we'll come back to this. Roberto, your turn. So you're the analyst. I'm sure you are partisan somewhere deep down, but you're here and you're nonpartisan guys. Professor in 2 different schools at the University of Southern California, the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism and the School for Policy Planning and Development, also director of the Thomas Rivera Institute. So tell us, do a little John King thing for us here. Pretend we don't have that map with the counties.
It's really bad. I've got spreadsheets.
Yeah, well, good. Okay, but everybody nationally has been talking about this in a very undifferentiated way. To the degree they're talking at all, they're talking about states, and they're giving us this image of big numbers. I think it's not quite like that, right? I think it's relative, although this is a very significant phenomenon, we're still talking about small numbers and relatively contained. So, I mean, just setting it up for folks, I mean, we know that in some of the swing states, Latino vote didn't make the margin at all. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Iowa, New Hampshire, Latinos, had little, if anything, to do with it. In 4 swing states, Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, Florida, could have made the difference. So what was involved in that? Do John King Suro. What can you tell us?
All right. Well, I think people have already spoken here about the importance of disaggregating this vote, and you can cut it a lot of different ways. One of in trying to understand what happened in November. One of a still nascent thought that's developing in my mind is trying to understand how Latino voters in different parts of the country functioned as part of the larger coalition that elected Obama. The focus has been traditionally very much and throughout this conversation as if these were actors operating in a void. That it's all about their characteristics, their identity, their views, when in fact we know that politics, especially in this go-round, the nature of coalition building in the end turned out to be one of the really critical factors, maybe the lasting historical change in electoral politics from these last two cycles is the effect of this coalition building. It really depends on whether it was a one-off or not. That's another question. So if you think about Latinos that way, as an element of the Obama coalition, more so than just this isolated sleeping giant, really unfortunate metaphor, which I've been dealing with since I first started writing about this too many years ago. One of the patterns that develops is the extent to which you see, with preliminary data still, that Latino voters in different parts of the country really did respond to circumstances, and that in the key states where they made a difference, the swing states that didn't matter in the end, Colorado, Nevada, Florida in particular. New Mexico is kind of an outlier because of its own peculiar politics and demographics. But in those states, there's some very interesting places to look and see what you've got. So and to contrast to places like Texas, where a lot of the future is going to play out.
Okay, so take us into those places.
Okay, so if you look at, take a place like Clark County, Nevada.
That's suburbs of...
It's Las Vegas. It's a suburb of Los Angeles. In more ways...
Spoken like a true...
No, it is. Because,
spoken like a true Angelino, yeah, okay.
No, but I mean, politically it is, and we see this in this election.
So what do you mean?
The migration from within the United States to Las Vegas over the last 10 years has been driven overwhelmingly by Californians, and mostly to Clark County. And as a result, you now have the state where one urban area has got the biggest concentration of votes, and the people in that urban area are distinctly different than the rest of the state.
Okay.
I mean, and Latinos included. Latinos to a certain extent have acculturated into and Clark County now has its own political life. The Democratic Party has its own political life there. Despite Alfonso's good efforts, the Republican Party there developed a Tea Party alternative that went way off the charts. And so it's an example of there, Denver as well, different kind of Democratic coalition, somewhat different roots, different flavor, different opposition. But in Denver County and Arapahoe County, which is the southern and eastern suburbs of Denver, you saw Latinos really functioning as part of a working coalition.
So what does that mean in terms of numbers? I mean, help us understand that.
Well, in Denver, Latinos make up 30% of the population.
30?
About 30. 30% of this is no 30% of the eligibles.
Right.
In Denver are Latinos. In Denver County, Obama carried it by 74%. Clark County, Latinos make up 20% of the electorate. Obama carried it by 56 and change.
So it's what you're saying. It's Latinos as part of a broader Democratic
part of a broader,
sweep.
not as singularly making a decision on their own, but operating within a coalition. And I think that has real implications both in the way you read these numbers, more importantly, as we in the second part of the conversation, how you imagine them as political actors going forward. But I would contrast this, for example, to Bexar County, Texas, San Antonio, heralded home of the Castro brothers, the future of the Democratic Party.
The good Castro brothers.
The good Castro brothers, right. Our Castro brothers.
Mayor of San Antonio, and what's the other one?
Congress.
Bexar County, 50% of the eligibles are Latino, right?
50%.
50%. And Obama carried it by 51.6% of the vote. So these numbers take some digging, but it's clear that there you had in Bexar County, where the new coalition is being born, this place where, Texas is going to turn purple, and Bexar County is the new Boston. You've got to ask yourself about that Latino vote. It's a very middle class, very middle of the road Mexican American vote, and in that context, where there's a weaker Democratic coalition and a much larger messaging from the Republican Party, you got what would appear to be a much more even split. We're going to have to do precinct level analysis there to really try and figure that out.
But as a sort of, if you were an uninitiated listener, what would be stunning here is that there are these places in America where it's 20%, 30%, 50% Latino vote, right? That's the first stunning
right, but
thing.
that doesn't predict what the outcome's going to
Yes,
be.
no, yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You can look at the Hispanic share,
It doesn't tell you.
and that doesn't tell you how it's going to turn out.
What was the split eventually in San
Pardon me?
Antonio? What was the just among Latinos percentage?
We don't know.
We don't know yet.
We don't know yet.
Oh, wow.
All we have is the overall outcome. Yeah,
That's what we need to look for.
Right.
Right.
But Miami-Dade is another. Florida is another place where Miami-Dade is now the home of a really interesting, complicated, mixed-up political coalition, where you have Cubans and non-Cuban Hispanics finding common cause with African Americans, Haitians, a big LGBT community, big arts community, a lot of internal migrants from New York, where the same way Clark County has been, you've got a core of white Democratic activists that have brought California politics to Nevada. In Miami, you've got a core of New York, Northeastern Democratic activists who brought those politics to South Florida. And within that, you're now starting to see very effective Latino players. A Democratic congressman won a race against a highly flawed Republican candidate, but still won, who formed a coalition that went from Miami Beach through working class neighborhoods all the way down to the Keys, with very distinct, different working class whites, gays, snowbirders, and then a big chunk of Cuban and non-Cuban Latinos. So you ask this. In the second part of it, it really then you start thinking about identity politics in a different way. If you are thinking of a group that has flexed its muscles by virtue of being part of a coalition, as opposed to having flexed its muscles as being a plaintiff, as having been alone, as being outsider, saying, these are my claims, and I am pressing these claims alone, as opposed to saying, I have achieved a level of success by being part of a much larger political establishment.
Okay, interesting. So Dan, you're nodding away. Come in.
A couple of things. I agree with Roberta. I think you need to see this and understand the Latino vote as part of, and certainly Chicago viewed Latinos and this president from multiple years back, saw them as part of a coalition and of a governing, both a political coalition, but also a governing coalition. And there's historical evidence, obviously, for what Roberto was just talking about in terms of who engages what community and their voting behavior later. Cubans are an interesting example, right? There's two big pockets of Cuban Americans in the United States. One in South Florida, which until this election was a predominantly Republican voting phenomena, and those in Union City, New Jersey, who have electorally expressed themselves via the Democratic Party. And a lot of that goes to who engaged them when they showed up and cultivated their political activity and included them in the political activity that was going on at that time in those communities. So I think there's a lot to be said for viewing the influence of Latinos in this cycle and particularly going forward as part of a broader coalition. And one that, Alfonso, and I've heard time and time again, Republicans love to go back to the Reagan quote. The national exit poll this year shouldn't give you a lot of comfort It's 2/3 support for abortion rights, 60% support for the Affordable Care Act, almost 59% support for same-sex marriage. This is among Hispanics in the national exit poll. That doesn't sound particularly socially conservative to me.
No.
So what if
and also the question I think at some level becomes, and this is more for the demographers and the people who I'm not a quant, which is a dangerous thing to say in this day and age. Are Hispanic millennials more like millennials?
Right.
Or
We're gonna
are Hispanic
come to that.
millennials
Yes.
like traditional Hispanics, if such a thing exists?
Yeah. So save that thought. Save that thought. So let's come back to you, Lynn. Let's dig a little deeper, and I'm trying to keep putting you on the spot on this.
Yeah, no,
but,
no,
you
no,
know,
I'm
and
sure.
Roberto, I'm interested in your take too.
Look, let me-
Can Republicans appeal to Hispanics, even if we could take the immigration thing off the table? Can we appeal?
Let me quickly respond to Dan. Look, I think on social issues and Latinos, we have to do a lot of research because there's contradictory data. You have the exit polling. You have recent polling from Illinois showing that Latinos there are the majority are for marriage and for and believe abortion should be illegal. I think the Pew Hispanic Center social numbers on abortion that contradict that exit polling. I never said that we were going to win the Latino vote exclusively with social issues, that had to be part of the mix. My point is that we didn't, and going to Roberto's point, absolutely. I think that the Obama campaign did a marvelous, superb job in building coalitions, in really spending money, outspending us on Latino grassroots outreach incredibly. In some places there was absolutely no outreach from grassroots outreach from the Republican side. But it seems to me that at the end, it's not only about coalitions or about being the community. Yes, we have to be there early. We have to spend money in grassroots efforts. That is key to compete. But at the end, with Latinos, ideas matter. And I go back to immigration. If Republicans bought this idea, fed to them by Republican strategists within the Beltway, some people that you know about, that you've heard about. Mr. Rove, and I keep saying this because everybody says, oh, we should go back to Karl Rove's concept of the big tent. No, for Karl Rove, the big tent is big, but it's empty because it's just to talk about the economy. Talk about the economy, talk about the economy, don't talk about immigration. We went into Nevada, people said, don't talk about social issues, don't talk about immigration. And I said, I'm going to talk about social issues and I'm going to talk about immigration. We need, and the problem was that they thought that the strategists told the Republican candidates to win the primary, you have to move to the extreme right on immigration. You have to sound like a restrictionist. And that is wrong. Every study shows the American people, Republicans and Democrats, support immigration reform. He could have had a much more constructive message from the beginning of the primary. And I think he would have been much more competitive in the general election. Now, I'm not saying that if you just have a good position on immigration, that you're going to win enough support from Latino voters, but at least they're not going to tune you out. Yeah. Because we were tuned out completely. They were not listening to us. And again, I go back to Spanish language media, which I did a lot. I was part of the Univision coverage of election night, and it sounded like we're covering the presidential election and immigration because of the emphasis on immigration. It was all about immigration. So it can go a very long way. Ideas matter. And to finish, I think that also the last Pew Hispanic Center poll on party affiliation is very revealing. I think it shows that up to 51% of Latinos today, in terms of party affiliation, identify as independent. I would not reach the conclusion that Republicans have lost the Latino vote forever and Democrats, are really winning over the Latino vote. Latinos at the end didn't vote for Obama because they were enamored with Barack Obama. I know that's what the campaign thinks, but that's not what happened. We had a terrible candidate, ran a lousy campaign, and it had terrible positions on immigration.
Okay, so I want to go down the row, starting with Roberto. can we take, I mean, assuming Republicans could wipe the slate clean on immigration, you know, next week, which we all know is not going to happen. It's going to be a long, hard road to wipe that, to get to solve it. How long is the memory of this going to last? I mean, when African Americans vote today, you know, so lopsidedly Democratic, they're not remembering the 1960s and 70s, but at some level they're remembering the 1960s and 70s. I'd like to hear all of you talk about what's the half-life. You know, even if we could get it right now, how do you see that playing out?
Well, you know, if you judging from, we don't have a lot of past performances to base this on, except for one very dramatic one, which is California, where the Republican Party succeeded in the mid-1990s as painting itself as the party taking a hard line on immigration, and one that was exuberant about rhetoric that was in images that were quite graphically demonizing.
They keep coming.
Right, they keep coming. That was the Pete Wilson's ad in the 1994, his successful reelection. Much harsher rhetoric than anything we've seen. Much more memorable, still on YouTube and playable, but had a really lasting impact. One of the dynamics of the immigration issue that I think seems quite clear is that it works very well, always has, as a negative mobilization issue. You can mobilize people to anger over immigration on both sides of the issue. It's worked both ways. It's actually worked it has a much longer and effective history of animating political behavior towards restriction than it does towards generous policies. But you can also, as the Republicans have shown in the last 10, 15 years quite consistently, you can really create grudges among people by demonizing them through immigration. So how long does it last? How deeply is the wound here? You know, it's really hard to say. Yeah. You look at the presidential level in particular, the Republican share has bounced around, you know, to some extent. I mean, George H.W. Bush got up to the mid-30s. Ronald Reagan brought it up to the mid-30s. Bob Dole, in the midst of the anti-immigrant sentiment of the 1990s, took it back below 30. George W. Bush got it back up to the magic 40% that Karl Rove thought was the jumping off point for neutralizing all these questions. So, you know, we're talking about a fairly small margin of voters here. So if you know, a 10% shift in the Latino votes, moving 1 million to 1.3 million, you know, the actual, what the turnout is, we don't really know yet. It's going to take a while. The exit poll numbers are losing credibility as time goes on. But that's, I don't want to get too geeky with you yet. But say, you know, a shift of 1 million voters, 1.5 million voters, and Romney would have been in the mid-30s in terms of his share. And everybody would have said that was a pretty good night for a Republican. Now, what would have happened in terms of actual states? I knew you were going to ask. You know,
and then I want to go down the road.
It's interesting because it doesn't, it would have, I'll leave it to the pundits to determine whether, you know, if the exit polls were correct, which is an F, and you shifted 10%, took 10% of the Latino vote out of Obama's column and put it on Romney's column, Romney would have squeaked Florida, would have clearly carried Florida, would not necessarily have carried Nevada or Colorado, but they would have been close. Nevada would have been very, I mean, whisker close. And Colorado would have been closer. It would have been close, it wasn't even close. So it was not, that would not have been a panacea. a lot of this Latino vote is padding states like New York and California. Obama had this much touted margin of 4.5 million votes among Latinos, right? 3.5 million Latino votes. About 40% of that margin sits in New York, California, Illinois. It's just where he got ridiculous amounts of votes. But it doesn't, you could spend a lot of time and money racking up those votes, and it's bragging rights for one night.
So, Dan,
but we did, right? The interesting thing is those are places where, again, it's one of these counterfactual hypotheticals. What would a targeted campaign to turn out Latinos look like, and what would the effect be if, Pete Wilson hadn't done us the favor in California a couple decades ago?
One other thought that I forgot that's important to this, that'll move this conversation forward briefly. The other part of this, the narrative of immigration in this election that I think is really one of the extraordinary achievements of the Obama campaign was to deflect all blame for anything that has happened on immigration and make this an issue in which the Republicans were consistently the bad guys.
Poor candidate.
But forget Romney. Leave Romney out. Romney's just, they put a giant pile of doo-doo there for him, and he stepped into it. Yeah. But they put the doo-doo there in a remarkable way.
What an image.
One key statistic in all this. Since the day Barack Obama was inaugurated, 1 out of every 10 Mexicans living in the United States has been deported. 1 out of 10. Nobody mentioned that.
Except Alfonso in a
well,
town
you didn't
hall.
get very far with that. Everybody kept saying, under me, you're going to self-deport. Well, the answer was, under you, they're being deported.
Just quickly.
Okay,
but also, Republican Congress who appropriates the funds to do that has a lot to do that. But rather than get into an immigration debate,
talk about this long-term thing. How? I mean, in your view, how long is this? Are we scarred forever? Can we forget this? Can we get over this?
This goes to Roberto's point. Republicans have a huge brand problem right now among Latinos, and it's SB 1070. It's Sensenbrenner, right? I mean, and a lot of it stems from the immigration issue and how it's been handled by the two parties. I think that, and this is somewhat dangerous with the word immigration works behind me to say. I mean, I think there's an immigration-related lesson, or there's a danger of overlearning an immigration-related lesson for both parties. I think Republicans are fooling themselves if they think they fully solve their Latino problem by now coming to the table on comprehensive immigration reform. And I think Democrats are fooling ourselves if we think we've locked this up. President gets this done, and we've locked this up for time immemorial. That the result, what we saw in 12, obviously had an immigration overlay, had a Republican branding problem, but it also was the result of a very deliberate incorporation of Latinos into the governing coalition, into the kind of daily life of the Obama administration, right? And it's little things. It's inviting the anchors of Univision and Telemundo to the pre-State of the Union lunch that before it was just the mainstream media that got invited to. It's the speaking Spanish from the White House podium for the first time ever during a regularly scheduled White House press briefing. There's and a lot of this built into respect, right?
Yeah, respect.
Issues matter tremendously. Respect is it has to go with the issues. And I think it's that combination. And again, 60% support for the Affordable Care Act. A middle-class mentality within Latinos who appreciate what the president has done, and that the president's priority was on the middle class and his opponents was elsewhere.
But I like
that combination, I think, is what worked and what will continue to work. But Democrats make a big mistake if we go, we've locked this up. This is ours. All we have to do to really nail it down is comprehensive immigration.
And that wouldn't be good for Latinos either.
Right.
I mean, the last thing Latinos want to be is African Americans
right, is to be
taken for
segmented.
granted, taken for
Right.
granted by one and ignored by the other. Right? That's the last thing.
I don't think you can get away with that.
Well,
tomorrow.
because of the size.
Well, because the precedent thing.
Right.
Let me say just two things very quickly.
The ignoring part of it, I don't think that works anymore.
Right.
Going
Like
back,
African Americans kind of squirts points there with the guy.
Yeah, but
going back to quickly
His
to the
wife and
deportation
daughters.
issue. When we ran that ad in Nevada, it was just Nevada. I had never seen the Obama campaign reacting so quickly. I mean, they issued several statements. That ad, which again was just run in Clark County, Nevada, got coverage from CNN, from all the major media outlets. At that time, I said, we're onto something. Hopefully, the Republican Party, the conservative super PACs will get it.
But what's your
It didn't happen.
what's your prediction of how can we get over this? Like,
Well, absolutely. The great thing about Latinos is they're very independent-minded. I don't know if you can really poll this, but they are. And this is a community in flux. And that's what we have to understand, that, again, I think that if we engage them, they will respond favorably to the conservative message. Barack Obama wasn't the first one. Again, this idea that he was the first one to invite Jorge Ramos and Maria Elena Salinas and Jose Diaz-Balart to the White House. You know, I was in the Bush administration. I remember President Bush being extremely good with Spanish language media. I mean, President Bush and the campaign in 2000, 2004 was extraordinary in terms of the Latino media. Can Latinos forget? Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the Pete Wilson debacle in California. Well, only a few years later, George W. Bush was winning with 40 to 44% of the Latino vote, 2004, only 8 years ago.
Not in California.
Not in California.
Oh, not California.
Right.
That's right. Not
California's
California.
deep blue.
Not California. No, not California. Not in New York. That's right. But we were extremely competitive. I don't think Latinos have forgotten about that. I think Latinos understand that Ronald Reagan was the last one to pass immigration reform. They understand that George W. Bush worked very hard for immigration reform. And I think what we allow ourselves is for a small group within the GOP to hijack this issue and become the vocal voice on immigration. The problem with Republicans is the majority remained silent. Remain silent. Can we take over? Absolutely. But I don't think Latinos are going to keep this in their mind. If they have a Republican candidate who's good on immigration, who can make a populist case for why limited government and free economy is better for Latinos, they will support the Republican candidate, no problem.
good, Dan. So now, and take us back also. Say what you're going to say, but then take us back to your millennial voter question, because I think that's really interesting. I'd like you to all to think about that. What is the millennial Latino voter going to look like?
I'll grant you that the Bush family has got it right in terms of how to message the Latinos, right? You can go to school on ad Jeb Bush, a Banderas ad that Jeb Bush ran in his re-election campaign.
It wasn't only the Bush family.
You can go. Look, George W. Bush ran an ad that is inconceivable of a Republican candidate running today, where the only flag that the candidate waved during the ad was the Mexican flag.
Oh my God.
Right. In his hand. I mean, if you just watch the image, it looked like he was running for president of Mexico, not president of the United States.
Oh, he's a Texan.
Right? No. It's a different. Right. It's a different sensibility.
Like a Nixon to China thing.
Right. It's a different sensibility and
confidence
and
about
right.
that.
And again, I think we as Democrats need to be very careful to think this is over with Latinos. It's not. I think the playing surface is a beneficial one to the Democrats right now, and I think there's plenty of work, but the work needs to continue to solidify that. This is an electorate that is too diverse. There's generational change happening in it. You need to stay engaged. You need to, those 800,000 to 1 million Hispanics who are aging into the electorate need to be reached out to, need to be cultivated, need to be worked, quite frankly, by both parties. I'm hoping the Republicans won't, as a partisan. And then there is this question, and I don't know, I don't think the research has been done yet, and Loretto can correct me if I'm wrong here, in terms of this kind of millennial question, right? The Latino electorate is young and getting younger. And the question is, how are they going to behave like millennials? Quite frankly, are millennials going to behave like millennials as time goes forward?
When they're not millennials.
When they're no longer millennials,
well,
right?
when there's somebody else being millennials.
Right, exactly.
When millennials are 30 years old.
Right, yeah.
Right.
I mean, so you can overlearn the lessons in any given moment politically quite easily. But again, the Latino millennials or these Latinos who are coming of age, aging into the electorate, in places like Texas is one experience, and they're likely to have one set of kind of values and voting behavior. And when they're aging into the electorate in South Florida, it's a different thing. So again, we got to be very careful to overthink this and oversimplify this as we do the analysis.
You know,
Or-
it's
Well, we
not
can
so
talk a
hard.
little bit
Wait a
about
minute.
things like Spanish language media and issues, can't we? I mean, isn't it?
Well, let's just talk about this part of it
Right.
first. It's not, you don't need to overthink it a lot. There is a very good political analyst who's not much in favor in many circles these past few weeks for his predictive skills. and for his actual arithmetic skills on camera.
Right.
Karl Rove
Yes.
worked these numbers in 1992, 93. I remember hearing him talk about this stuff in Texas in the 1980s. I mean, the people we're talking about who are going to make all those big deals were already born then, right? So the demographics haven't changed. His numerology argued that Republicans, to be competitive in the demography of this decade, had to consistently reach between 40, 45, sometimes high 40s of the Latino vote nationally. Don't have to win it.
Right.
And you're not talking about a huge dramatic shift. That where Latino voters are, and this is making on a series of assumptions, right? And there are a number of assumptions that then peel away from those numbers. I mean, one of them is what was not anticipated, and that's a really important factor in all this, is the recession and its effect on population trends. So people have stopped moving. Right? We have very low rates of internal migration, which was one of the factors that was transforming the politics of places like Virginia, North Carolina, the metropolitan Texas.
Right.
Houston, Dallas have been converted politically by people coming from elsewhere. The Intermountain West. So if you halt that, and when you're thinking about Latinos as part of a coalition, the key element of that coalition was this mixture of newcomers, Latino newcomers and newcomers from other places, particularly if you think to the future of some place like North Carolina or Georgia, even at congressional district level. So if you halt that, that's one thing. The other question is, what do you...
won't halt it permanently. It's
Well, no,
slowed
but for
now
how
in the
long?
downturn.
We're into a 5-year lag. So when does it pick up? How long does it take to get back to the levels of migration that created this political environment, which was created 10, 15 years ago? And by the time this Latino electorate gets to voting age, will they start voting early? Always a question.
Right.
Not, and it varies
Not a
from
habit.
one cycle to
Right.
another. Very hard to tell.
Right.
Very difficult to understand what mobilizes people when they're young.
Well, and will they be educated enough? Because that will change their voting patterns, right? Like how.
Well, that's, then the question is, who are they?
Yeah.
What are their values? Where do they fit? Do they vote as Latinos? Do they vote as people who didn't go to college or who had a very hard time going to college? Do they vote economic interests? And we have a good idea of what those economic interests are likely to be, given where the country is now.
Low income.
Low
voter
income,
issue.
working class,
Yeah.
many of them.
Yeah.
Their parents don't have the money to
Yeah.
easily send them to college.
Yeah.
The public education system's doing terribly with them. College-going rates are up, but they're not going to four-year degrees.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of reasons to assume that what the economic shape of this, and if you take the idea that they're going to come into politics as coalition players, then you change the nature of identity politics then somewhat. You know, you're looking at a different kind of coalition.
Right.
It's not based on Hispanicity necessarily.
Right.
But rather on.
Sorry.
Let Dan and then I'll
I think we're agreeing. Like the point here is, it behooves, building off of the very last thing you said, it behooves whomever wants them to be a part of their electoral thing to keep them engaged in the coalition, right, and not to think this one issue has kind of permanently made them a member of the coalition.
And this is the key for Republicans, and I agree that we can't overthink it. I mean, what are the projections? What are going to be their interests? It's hard to say right now. But one thing is clear. Republicans cannot engage Latinos 2 months before a general election. I was in Tampa, and I was talking to one of the co-chairs of the Romney Hispanic effort, and I was complaining that I hadn't seen anything going on in battleground states where Latino vote is decisive. And he looked in my eyes and said, Alfonso, now is when the campaign starts. I'm like, oh my God, we're going to lose big. And we did. But it can be either 6 months before the election. It has to be a continuous effort to engage Latinos continuously. And again, as I said, to explain to them why policies based on limited government and free economy are good policies for Latino businesses. Latinos are opening businesses 3 times as fast as the national average. I don't think they have still understood the impact that, say, Obamacare is going to have in their businesses, but they soon will. But if we don't engage them, if we don't explain that to them, they're not going to understand. So this is key. And then finally, if you're, obviously I go back to the issue of immigration. I mean, you need to have, those who've remained silent for so long at this point have to raise their voices. The great thing is that now there's an avalanche of Republicans coming forward and saying, I'm for immigration reform. From Rick Santorum, the latest, to Sean Hannity, who says he's evolved and now he's for immigration reform. Well, you're going to see a lot of people who remain quiet on the issue coming forward and saying, you know what, I'm actually going to tackle this issue. I'm conservative and I believe in immigration. And finally, conversations are starting in House and Senate. And so I am hopeful. I am hopeful. But again, if we have a good position on immigration, if we don't engage the Latino vote directly, understanding its diversity, for so long, Hispanic outreach from the Republican side has been talking to Hispanic business elites. I remember one event that a Hispanic organization did, and I mean, I love this organization. They do great work, but they did it at the Doral Resort in Miami.
We were both there.
And I just didn't really get it. I think there were really more Latino voters in the kitchen that are out in the, and I mean, but it says something.
Yeah,
it says something about where are we engaging them. You know, I think we have to go to the communities. The basic community organizations that are conservative are the evangelical churches. Let's use them. Let's go to the grassroots. But that hasn't happened.
Great. Okay, so let's open it to audience questions. Somebody's got a microphone. Let's start on the ledge there. Anybody sitting on the ledge deserves to get the first question.
Yeah. Hopefully only literally, not figuratively. Right.
Please identify yourself.
Sure. Thanks very much. Cindy Arnson from the Latin American program here. Alfonso, you mentioned, the record rate of deportations under Barack Obama. I'm wondering if you can sort of, all of you, look ahead into your crystal ball. We all know that if there is immigration reform, it's going to involve, a compromise between things that Democrats want and that Republicans want. What do you think are the elements of a potential immigration reform that will most turn off Latino voters in terms of trading off, some form of, legalization of people already in the country in exchange for, tougher enforcement, a bigger wall, all that sort of. Where do you see the politics of this kind of driving wedges into the
Right.
community.
So frankly, I think that if we do legalization, if we do path to citizenship, the other stuff will not be that significant in the Latino community. But
I agree. If it's legalization that provides them at least some form of legal residency, I don't think it will be an issue. Tougher enforcement is not going to be an issue to Latinos. Question here is the path to citizenship. I can already see the Democrats saying, well, Republicans are against a path to citizenship. I think Republicans there would have to say we're against a special path to citizenship. Ideally, I would like to see a path to citizenship, especially for the young dreamers. But I think I agree with Tamar. Legalization has to be part of this.
Dan,
I'm curious as to what Tamar meant by legalization, but
I meant that piece is much more important
Yes,
than
no,
the
right,
rest.
yes.
That's the turkey in the middle of the table.
But I think
exactly
I think,
what the
I think path
vegetables
to
are.
citizenship
Not that
is-
important.
I think path to citizenship is the turkey in the table, in
Yeah,
the middle of the table. I think again, if
Probably the
if-
wrong metaphor.
Right. Yes, but if there's a path to citizenship with a reasonable amount of time, and I'm not quite sure what reasonable is right now, then I think the rest of it falls into place quite simply from a kind of Latino activism perspective. I think, quite frankly, that's going to be, as I think you just heard in these two answers, where there's still a lot of bridging to be done in Washington, and I think within the Republican Party in terms of how far they're willing to go on the question of path to citizenship, not just second-class status here in the United States. That's I think, will be the real rub in the debate.
Roberto.
Yeah, I have to respectfully disagree.
Why we invite you?
To be John
That's not
King.
the only reason.
Just to disagree, not to be respectful.
No, but if you look, if you think back over the last 10 years or so of failure in immigration policy, actually more than 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, depends on how long
you've
far
been
back
watching.
you want to go.
Yeah.
It starts making me feel old. One of the developments, particularly since the mid-2000s, has been the emergence of a fairly vigorous immigrants' rights movement in this country, and a litigation power and a protest power that didn't exist before. You all talk, all of you have talked here as if you missed the key to all immigration legislation in the past. Maybe it'll be different this time, has been in the details. So legalization just means nothing. There are two things that I think we know from past experience about the nature of these proposals. One is that a legalization proposal is going to be a giant game of chutes and ladders, right? With all kinds of qualifications, a process for getting into it. They're going to be right to the last minute bargaining over, let's set the start date here or here. And you're tossing a million people one way or the other, depending on a deal that's made, in one of those gilded rooms in the Capitol building when it goes to conference, right? So we know that. All that stuff will be litigated. It will be a process. The process of legalization itself, given the current framework, is designed to be long.
Right.
So it is going to be litigated and is going to be a process people are going to be going through for a long time. Right. The other thing they'll be full of potholes. Full of questions about implementation ability, rights to counsel. I mean, we're talking about taking a framework now legally that is intensely hostile to the legal rights of the foreign-born. A democratic artifact, by the way. But let me continue.
No, but we have 5 minutes and lots of other questions.
One last point. The other piece of the architecture of immigration policy that I think that we can be pretty confident about is that as you build an umbrella under which certain people are sheltered, life outside that umbrella gets harsher.
No question.
Right? No question. Right. So outside, that means whoever doesn't get in is going to face a much more wicked situation in terms of much higher rates of deportation, fewer rights when you're...
But presumably they're going to blame both parties, right? That's presumably if they, in the ideal world where we make a deal.
I'm just saying, but this is, people are portraying this as, by April we'll pass this law and then Latinos will forget about it.
Right.
It will be a living, breathing controversy in Latino communities for the next decade.
Okay, next question, and we have lots of questions, so please make your questions brief, and maybe we'll accumulate a few now. Man with the microphone.
I have a question about immigration. It seems has been discussed more as a unilateral issue here. Where does Mexico have a role here? This is in many ways a foreign policy question. The Obama administration has little or no real relationship with Mexico, at least even the new president. And I do wonder whether this will ultimately become a matter of solving this as two nations can rather than just one.
Okay, next question, the man right there in the blue shirt.
I'm Miguel Diaz. I'm a Foreign Service spouse. Great panel. My kudos to the Wilson Center for hosting it. I have two questions, if I may.
No, one. We have
one question. I could only speak for myself as a Hispanic that voted for Obama, but I'm not sure whether I did it because I was scared to be Jesus out of the Romney campaign, or whether I did it for love of what the Democrats have done for Hispanics. And I guess my question to Roberto is, I mean, can you quantify these sentiments, the fear of the Republican Party versus the love of the Democratic agenda, and to what extent those different approaches inform the way that the different campaigns might go after the Hispanic vote in the future?
That's a great question. The woman in front of you in the red shirt. Please identify yourself.
Yeah, Andrea Barron, George Mason University. Yeah, I'm wondering whether you think the Latino position on abortion is more like that of Joe Biden, who said he personally opposes abortion, but he would not impose his views on the rest of the country, or whether they're more similar to Paul Ryan's, who believes that his particular religious views should be imposed on the rest of the country, who might not share them.
Okay, tricky. The man right here in the white shirt. You guys are going to have to put all this together fast.
My name is Samar Chatterjee. I have a concern that Republicans, like I did vote for Barack Obama 4 years ago, at this time not, because I think he betrayed most of his promises. And I would like to see his Nobel Prize withdrawn too. This would be the first recall of a Nobel Prize. But given that, I think the Republicans should move, in my opinion, to the left of Democrats, which means you've got to get rid of your right-wing fascists that you have in the party. And that's the only way to win, and I hope.
What's your question?
So my question is, will the country move just like we gave George Bush 2 terms, even though he had screwed up after the 4 year? Is it that if Hillary Clinton runs as the Democratic, she will get the big hammer for all the failures of the Obama administration, and the Republicans will by default win?
Well, last question. Well, we got lots of questions still. Okay, let's take this round and then see if we have some time left over. Try to, we do only have a few minutes, so see what, treat this as your last word. See what you want to say.
Look at it. Okay, all right. Over to you now.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah.
Well, on the question of dealing with Mexico, you can imagine a situation, particularly if there's some kind of movement on some kind of legislation here, where there are conversations with Mexico about security and immigration, and particularly Central American migration through Mexico, which is, I think is likely to be increase in traffic is going to come through. There are already signs this year of really substantially mounting migration, that some of those countries are disintegrating. Mexico, there are conversations in the new administration there, are really great concerns about having essentially failed states next to them and looking to the U.S. for help in dealing with them. That could be a way of, right now there's ground there, and there are at the government ministerial level, there's thought being put into how you approach that. There are think tanks working on it. We'll see if that agenda develops. The fear-love question with Latinos. this vote has to be disaggregated, and a big chunk of it has to be set off to one side. I'd say 50% of it, maybe 55% of it, that's just not going to be in play. The Puerto Rican voters in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts are they're among the most liberal Democratic voters there are.
Yeah.
They voted for Obama 80-90%. They were the most vocal Democratic constituency opposed to the war in Iraq in 2003. I mean, they're a very distinctive part of our political landscape. They're not going to change. Latino Democrats in coastal California, it's just really hard to see where you get Republicans can hope to get more than 25 or 30% out of that big chunk in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. I mean, in Chicago and its suburbs. You're starting to talk, it starts to add up. I think in Cuba, a new dynamic has set in. I think Obama's opening of travel to Cuba has totally changed the game for the way Cubans think about it. So you're talking about large chunks of this electorate that are solidly Democratic. And there's a solid base there. So the game has been and will continue to be about a fairly small margin of this electorate in key places.
Okay. Good?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll do these as quickly as I can. I'm still enjoying what happened in November of 2012 to think about November of 2016, so I'll skip on that one. A two-word answer to your question, Joe Biden. And which is a segue over to your question. I would take exception with the premise of your question in terms of the Obama administration not having a relationship with Mexico. In my prior existence, before my summer vacation, I was the president's main Latin American policy advisor at the White House for 3.5 years. And this is kind of an anecdote, and it oversimplifies, but I had 34 countries that I was responsible for at the NSC. I visited no country other than one more than 3 times. I visited one country 17 times in the 3.5 years that I was at the White House, and that country happens to be Mexico. The intensity of the relationship between the two governments, the prior government, and now you've seen with Peña Nieto coming to meet the president just before his inaugural, Vice President Biden going to the inaugural, and this vice president doesn't go to a lot of inaugurations, so I think you should read into that. There's an intensity of relationship between the governments of the United States and Mexico across a broad range of issues. The media focuses on security questions, but it goes a lot further than that. So I think you will see that continuing. Immigration is a complicated question to deal with in the bilateral context. I think President Vicente Fox of Mexico kind of learned a political lesson in Mexico of staking too much on affecting the immigration debate in the United States over something that he really couldn't affect. And paid a political price at home for failure to deliver something that was never in his power to deliver, which was comprehensive immigration reform in the United States. I think Peña Nieto has learned that lesson, and I don't think you'll see him being particularly assertive of what should happen in the legal construct in the United States. I think you're exactly right. The question of transmigration has the Mexican government, the prior Mexican government, and this Mexican government very concerned. And they are looking at the problem in a very different way than they traditionally have. What comes of that, how you wrestle with it, that's not clear. I think that will be part of the conversation between the two governments. Central America, I know, is a part of the conversation, has been for several years between the two governments and will continue to be. So I think there is a very intense relationship between the government of the United States and the government of Mexico across a broad range of issues. On the particulars of what an immigration deal in the United States looks like, I don't think you'll see a whole lot of public and I think even private interaction on that question.
You want to say a quick last word on the Latino vote?
Actually, I guess to go to Miguel's question, I think it's really hard to disarticulate what happened in that sense. There was clearly concern, again, going back to the brand problem that Republicans have, of what a Republican victory would mean for Latino voters. But there was also, I think, a growing recognition among Latinos that they were part of a coalition, that they were wanted, and they were included, and they really were part of a going forward vision. Which one and where factored more? Hard to say. But I think therein lies the lesson of this election from a political standpoint. The inclusion in a very real way, and I think this is a two-way street, actually. Organized political Latinos also have to think about what they do now. Do they do their own thing, or do they incorporate themselves in multiple places into the coalition here in Washington and across the country? And I think that'll have a lot to say about the shape of Latino politics moving forward, whether it really takes on this coalition nature or whether it's still this other that has a relation, a variable relationship. And it may very well be that there are different answers to that at different levels of government.
In different states.
Yeah.
Well, very quickly, I agree with the issue of Mexico. Sadly, in 2000, when we began, we thought before 9/11 that we were going to move immediately on immigration reform. The relationship with President Fox was extraordinary, very, very close. After 9/11, it took a hit because of Mexico's position on a number of issues, including the effort in Iraq. However, I think the relationship with Mexico continued to be very intense. I think most experts would agree that the relationship with Mexico has weakened dramatically. I think that, well, perhaps Dan would.
Let's not go too deep. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Let's go to.
But I just don't see the same type of rapport or relationship with Mexico that we had under the Bush administration. I mean, how the Fast and Furious thing was handled. I mean, it was President Calderon himself who criticized the U.S. For that whole botched effort. On abortion, I will say that poll after poll, every single study that I've seen, with the exception of the exit polling, shows that the majority of Latinos believe that abortion should be legal, compared to 40% of the rest of the population. So I think they would agree with Mr. Ryan, which is the position of the Catholic Church and the Christian churches, which means that the churches have a lot of influence in the Latino vote. And then finally, on the Latino vote, look, it's really hard to say. Again, we're not a monolithic community. And I think, as Dan has said, and Roberto, I think both parties, but I think Republican Party has to do a major effort, overhaul of its efforts towards Latinos, and begin now. They cannot wait till the election. It has to be an ongoing effort, but an ongoing effort not only about immigration, but about every single other issue, explaining why conservative policies are good for Latinos. I don't believe at the end, like Governor Romney said, that Latinos voted for President Obama because of gifts. I honestly don't think it was because of Obamacare or anything else. I think it had to do a lot with immigration and the lack of inclusion in efforts towards Hispanics.
Great. So thank you very much. Thank you. I apologize to those of you who didn't get to ask a question. I think the speakers will be around for a few minutes. I love the fear and love question. I mean, it's really, I think, gets to a lot of, politics are about issues. In a way, we've parsed this out so well. Politics are about issues. Politics are about outreach and the machine. Politics in this case is about this one big issue that we've got to get off the table. But really what this is about is the future and how dynamic this is, and how both parties, particularly Republicans, I'm afraid, have a lot of work to do. So thank you all so much for being here, and thank you to 3 terrific panelists and all 5 terrific panelists.